In this presentation I'll be talking about trying to capture context and value, subtitled Skipping in Meta Theory and Falling into an Epistemological Hole. I'm Clayton Parry. I'll be talking through this, and I'm supported by Clayton Davies. We're both from UE. So I'm from Operations Management. I want to map and measure use processes via Internet of Things so I can improve offerings and the use experience. That's my goal. We have a project at the moment interested in user vulnerability, and I'm really looking at how can I develop business models that reduce the feeling of vulnerability in consumers. My starting point came from recognizing there's an information asymmetry, because the consumer knows what they do when they buy their products, their services, how they integrate them, and they do that in different contexts. But suppliers lack any visibility really of post-sale of their consumers using their products in the use space. How do your consumer combine what they've bought with the other things in their home? Now, as a consumer, currently your data is in verticals and taken by the firms you use, so that's your shopping, your energy, petrol, even your phone's constantly telling Google or whoever where you are. This misses the horizontals, the links between the data, where context is what you do, when and with who. You actually need the data across all those people. What is visibility? Well, there are three main perspectives, but I'm really interested in this bottom one here, which is the capability to use information to initiate and inform action. So the hub of all things is the platform repository we use to collect data. That HAT, we call it, collects Internet of Things data, and it makes it accessible to the consumer, the individual who owns the HAT, in one place. Now, when we undertook this work, there were only 6 HATs collecting data. That's now being scaled up. But what's key with the HAT data is it's owned by the individual, not the firm, and they're able to share it, to look at it, to play with it. And that's what we did here. So this work is quantitative data from sensors and systems in the home. We instrumented homes using Z-Wave sensors, and some qualitative data from interviews, user process descriptions, and some home visits. The focus in this particular work, when we thought about showering activity, because that's a difficult private space, it's wet, it's quite difficult to understand what goes on in the shower space. So our sensor data provided some quantitative measures. Here we see a shower room humidity sensor. You can see the peaks where somebody's having a shower. This is a flood sensor that was placed in the shower, so it activates when water runs. That allows us to time the shower. We also measured, quite simply using a measuring jug, the water flow rate over time. That allows us to then calculate how much water had flowed in the shower. I put a motion sensor, just hooked it onto a towel, so every time somebody used the towel it moved, and that indicated that that towel was in use in motion. You can see that here. We also used a simple weight measurement to show the depletion of shampoo over time. Now, analysis of all these different resources led to a categorization of data types. We showed that interaction data was data that was from the mechanisms you use, like taps, showers, doors, things that don't really change in the time period that you use them. Then we had experience data. That's resources that are transformed but not diminished. So things like towels, or in the kitchen, cups and plates. Then we have depletion data, which those things that are depleted at a higher rate than they're replenished. So most of the food you have, shampoo, these sorts of things, they run out. And then you've got consumption data. These are resources which you consume at the same rate they're replenished. So things like water and electricity. And you can think that there are different business models, different supply chain considerations behind all of those. Different sorts of provision of resources. This work was published in Supply Chain Management, an international journal, called Use Visibility Measures, if you want to look at that paper. When we start linking data and thinking about context, we can start to actually see what's going on. So here we can see the consumption of shower gel over time. You can see that there's a big drop there. That's where a dog knocked over a shampoo bottle. But there's some other steps in it, and what we saw there was the consumer, the individual whose data this is, I should say, the length of time of shower after a run increased, as did the consumption of shower gel, by 100%. So there's a very strong link there between running, consuming shower gel, and consuming water in the shower. This gives us some visibility of use, but what about value creation? Well, if we look at Professor Irene and Dr. Laura Smith's work on value creation, they identified 6 types of value in the literature: utility, economic worth, perceived satisfaction, net benefit, means end, and phenomenological experience. So Anderson and Nahus spoke about understanding what customers value, and they really were speaking about net value, value minus price paid, which seems to fit to this idea of net benefit, some trade-off between benefits and outlay, and that's where value is. Emma MacDonald, with co-authors, wrote a nice paper assessing value in use. They used means ends as their definition of value, which is all about the perceived attributes of an offer, and they did interviews after an event to see how people saw the value in what they'd purchased. Sandstrom et al. Wrote a nice paper on value in use linked to customer experience, which is most aligned, I think, to this idea of phenomenological experience. Value is not in the object, but in the user's use experience of the customer. So value is manifest in the relationship between subject and object, and subject and subject. So if we look at Vargo and Lash's service dominant logic, foundational premise 10 says value is always uniquely and phenomenologically determined by the beneficiary, which speaks strongly to that last categorization of phenomenological value. When we start to look at that and understand, well, when can we measure it? Well, the when's quite important, but time impacts on value. We've got this quote: phenomenological value experience is not restricted to linear time, which makes life more difficult. We draw on past, present and future in assessment of value. Then, phenomenological sense making is where current experience is always based on past experience. We've got routines or practices which repeat over time, though they don't go on forever. They will change when better things come along or something becomes inadequate. So our assessment of value is constantly being reassessed in context, depending on what other offers we have. So I'm now not really sure I understand phenomenological. I'm trying to operationalize the idea, and I can add more sensors, I can do more interviews looking at what went before the event of interest and what happened afterwards, and we can even start to use emotion capture from various sensors such as heart rate, galvanic skin response, that sort of thing. But what really is phenomenological experience value? So this is Husserl. Objects are conceived within the individual's perception of them, such as phenomenological value is attributed to the object as part of the interaction. Sartre, being precedes essence, and speaking about being, your being in the moment, and what you do, and the interaction is the essence of you in that moment. Because the individuals are continuously integrating and exchanging resources within their context, and that's inseparable. So this phenomenological value is emergent from this experience between subject and object. I'm not sure I understand the unit of analysis, or if it's even measurable. So I was lost in this space, and I looked at Gadamer's Truth and Method. He talks about the hermeneutic cycle developed from interpreting texts, looking at the whole, back to the parts, back to the whole. So obviously he'd be reading text, maybe looking at a paragraph, looking at an individual word, looking at the paragraph, and then maybe looking at the page or the whole book, and thinking about how that works. He talked about fused horizons, the horizon of his understanding, and how in dialogue with others, or even an internal dialogue, he could move forward to new horizons of understanding, and where past and present horizons, you have a fusion of horizons as we move forward. He calls this sort of process of thinking and developing and moving from one horizon of understanding to another the hermeneutic cycle. He says knowing is a process. He also said that our knowledge is not starting from a blank page. We come at things with prejudice because we have our own pre-understanding. We must accept that we don't know. We require mercy. And if we accept that the concept of mercy, that we're not skeptical when we come into these new ideas, we can then start to learn, because that helps us move forward. Our interpretation is also always goal-oriented. We're seeking to understand something for a reason. And I'm accepting here that I'm trying to understand value from a very driven, goal-oriented perspective, that I want to somehow measure it and make that useful for the consumer and also for businesses. So how can we maybe apply that? Well, if we start from the idea we have a proposition and we have two different areas of subjectivity 1 and 2, moving those two subjects together, we get to this idea of merged horizons after this dialogue. We can then maybe step from one horizon to another through this intersubjectivity, these discussions, these dialogues, expanding our horizons. And if we could somehow capture each one of these steps, then maybe we can see the stepping forward towards understanding value in use. We can add more data, we can track communalities, and develop new horizons, trying to edge towards this epistemic congruence. Hopefully that will help us get out of this epistemological hole that we're talking about. Perhaps this will help us emerge practical understanding and help us capture phenomenological value, or maybe it's a different sort of value that I'll manage to capture. So this is the sort of end, or maybe the beginning. The hermeneutic researcher, in attempting to understand a phenomenon, must accept they are likely wrong in their current understanding. This is very much an ideas piece, something to share just where I am right now, and hopefully that's useful.